So happy New Year to everyone. And now, who is Fred Rosenbaum? Everyone knows Fred, our scholar in residence, but even more importantly than that, he was the founder and director for many decades of Lehrhaus Judaica, which became the largest adult Jewish education institution, nonprofit. I think even in all of the West Coast, certainly in Northern California. He is an award-winning author. He has written several books. This is one of my favorites, about those Jews in the resistance. This is about Eva Libitsky and many other ones as well as I think two versions of the history of the Jews of the Bay Area. I think one is called The Cosmopolitan. I have it in my library, but I couldn't find out why before today's program. He continues to speak on many, many subjects, and we're lucky to have him as our scholar. And now, remember, you can ask questions with the chat function, which Fred will be glad to answer. Fred, take it away.
Thank you, Riva, and welcome back, everyone, for another year of learning through film. I just feel so honored, to be the scholar in residence again. So, Driving Miss Daisy takes place in an affluent German Jewish enclave of Atlanta, Druid Hills, from the late 1940s to the early 70s. And I'm impressed with how authentic it feels. Perhaps this is because it's a family memoir, according to David Urey, the author of the acclaimed Broadway play, Driving Miss Daisy. And he also wrote the screenplay and was an advisor on the casting of the movie. Can we see the first image, Neely? Now, there you see David Urey on the right. He's not as well known as he should be. He is the only playwright ever to win a Tony, an Oscar, and a Pulitzer Prize, all for his 3 dramas set in Atlanta, where he grew up in Druid Hills in the 1940s and 50s. You see some other versions of the play here. In one, on the upper left, you see that Daisy was played by Angela Lansbury and Hoke by James Earl Jones. That was in Australia. Then there was a revival of the Broadway play in 2010. Vanessa Redgrave is Daisy. James Earl Jones is Hoke in that one as well. Now, Daisy's fine house that's used in the filming was well known to Urey. As a boy, he played with friends there, like August Wilson, who wrote 10 plays about his Black neighborhood, Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Hill District. Urey's work falls into a genre known as community stories. And that means a deep, sensitive probing of the terrain that the author knows best. The character of Daisy is modeled after Urey's grandmother, and Hoke is modeled after her chauffeur named Hoke Colburn. Okay, you can move that screen now. Thank you. Morgan Freeman, who played Hoke both on Broadway and the movie, brilliantly inhabits the role, in my opinion. He too is in very familiar surroundings. The actor was brought up in Mississippi during segregation, and his father had worked as a chauffeur for an older white woman. The real Hoke had passed away by the time the play opened in 1987, 2 years before the film. But his son was at the premiere. marveling at Freeman's credibility in the role, his son said, "I never thought I'd see my father again, but there he was up on the stage." Urey based the character of Daisy's assimilated son, Booley, on himself, an un-Jewish Jew, and another genuine Southern type. Playwright Urey did not have a bar mitzvah, but was confirmed at 15 at the ultra-reform temple that Daisy attends in the film. There, though, he received the barest Jewish education. His family celebrated Christmas, not quite like the extravaganza at Booley's home, but with an elaborately decorated tree visible through the window. Young Urey was told, "It's an American holiday, just like Thanksgiving." Until he left Atlanta for college in the North, he went to only one Passover Seder and said he felt like he was in a foreign country. He always considered himself a Jew. He never denied it, but described growing up Jewish in Druid Hills as a burden, an affliction, something he was born with like a lame leg. And that lament can only be understood in the troubled context of Atlanta Jewry. An historical event hangs over this unique community, and it's unnamed in the film because it would be too traumatic for Daisy to even hear it. I'm speaking, of course, of the lynching of the German Jew Leo Frank in 1915, often considered the worst anti-Semitic act in all of American history. When the words Leo Frank were spoken in earshot of one of Urey's aunts, he recalls, she was so upset that she ran from the room. One of his plays in the Atlanta trilogy is about the Frank case. And now at age 86, he says he's prouder of that than any other work in his prolific output of plays, screenplays, lyrics, and musical scores. What was this horror that occurred when Daisy was almost 40 years old and which had to leave a lasting mark? Leo Frank was the 29-year-old manager of his uncle's large pencil factory in downtown Atlanta. A New Yorker, he had arrived in the fast-growing city 7 years earlier and married into an established Jewish family, a local Jewish family. In April 1913, a 13-year-old worker, Mary Fagan, was found murdered in the factory. She was not raped, but had been beaten and strangled to death. The police arrested Frank, and suspicion also fell on a black janitor, Jim Conley, whom another employee had seen washing blood off his shirt. 2 notes were found at the murder scene. They were supposed to be from Mary Fagan before she died, but they were written in a black Southern dialect. Quote, "A long, tall Negro said he would love me and did this by hisself." Hisself spelled Hisself. The notes were in janitor Conley's handwriting. He was short and stocky, so the description, long, tall, was clearly a way to shift suspicion from himself to another black worker, security guard Newt Lee. But after Frank's arrest, Connolly decided to pin the blame on him. He admitted to writing the notes, but claimed that his boss, after killing the girl, had dictated the words to him and given him $200. Connolly testified that Frank told him, "Why should I hang? I have wealthy people in Brooklyn." This star witness for the prosecution declared that Frank wanted his way with the girl. She refused him. He strangled her to death. And then he and Connolly moved the body to the basement where it was found. The Atlanta newspapers went into a mode of hysteria. The city's Hearst paper simply assumed Frank guilty. Right above his photo, with a blaring headline in a special extra edition, they proclaimed, "The Strangler is caught." Let's look at the next slide, please, Nilly. Here you see Leo Frank around the time of the trial. Through the entire ordeal, he was very calm, reticent, spoke in an even tone, I'd say to some extent stoic even. Now, let's look at the next image. Thank you. Sensational stories followed in other papers as well, even if they didn't condemn Frank. The innocent girl, the budding flower of Southern white womanhood, killed by the devil incarnate. Leading politicians unleashed a torrent of anti-Semitism, blaming the Jewish community for exploiting child laborers and ruining the state. Now, Mary did work for only 10 cents an hour. That's worth barely $3 today, $3 an hour. But this was typical throughout the South as it rapidly became more urbanized and industrialized. The fear that Jews were bringing about this hellish new world, destroying the rhythm of small town rural life, that was an underlying cause of the hatred. Okay, you can remove that slide now. Thank you. Still, given Georgia's long, ferocious history of racism, why didn't the fury center on Jim Connolly, almost certainly the real killer? Most commentators feel that this was such a heinous crime that a black wouldn't have been big enough to pay for it. The prosecuting attorney privately said, hanging a black man, quote, "ain't enough this time. We gotta do better," unquote. At trial, the wily Connolly also played into the stereotype of the lecherous Jew. He testified that Frank was a pervert, resulting from some kind of anatomical deformity, that he, quote, "ain't built like other men." In only 4 hours, the jury brought in the verdict, guilty. The judge imposed the death penalty. He had heard the thousands of people outside the courthouse screaming, "Hang the Jew or we'll hang you." 2 years later, after all the legal appeals were exhausted, the only hope left was for Governor John Slayton to commute the sentence. He received over 1,000 threats of death were he to spare Frank from the gallows. One of Georgia's leading politicians claimed that New York Jews were bribing Slayton so that he'd cheat the hangman. Yet the governor, who was an attorney and doubtful about Frank's guilt, decided to commute the sentence to life imprisonment. Pandemonium ensued. The state militia had to be called out to protect the chief executive's mansion. His political career was ruined. Frank was in a state prison about 100 miles away. But soon after Slayton's announcement, 25 men from Mary Fagan's hometown of Marietta, near Atlanta, abducted Frank without any resistance from his jailers. They brought him to Marietta and lynched him in a nearby forest. Let's look at the next slide. Now, I'm showing you these. No, this is really appalling to see Leo Frank hanging there, but I would direct your attention not to him so much, but to these people who did it. Look at the body language, look at the faces and the expressions. They're staring right at the camera, and they're crossing their arms as if this was a job well done. This was something they had to do, and it's done. One of them seems to be smiling. These homicidal vigilantes included a Protestant minister, an ex-sheriff, two former Supreme Court justices. Two former Superior Court judges. This is why most scholars feel it was this country's worst anti-Semitic act. There have been deadlier attacks on Jews, like the mass shooting at Tree of Life congregation only 5 years ago. But in Pittsburgh, there was an outpouring of sympathy and support from law enforcement, governmental officials, the media, non-Jewish clergy, and the general public. In this case, almost every segment of society betrayed Frank because he was a Jew. There was never an attempt to punish the perpetrators, even though their identities were well known, as you can see. Photos like these were sold as postcards for years afterward. Okay, can remove that image, Neely, thank you. Now, reflecting public opinion, Frank's prosecutor became governor of Georgia. The leading anti-Semitic propagandist was elected US Senator. Atlanta's Jews, then numbering only about 5,000 out of a population of 150,000, were stunned. They had shown loyalty as early as the American Revolution. And in the Civil War, they fought and died for the Confederacy in the same proportion as non-Jews. Later, they boosted the local economy as retailers and industrialists. Now, this seemed to count for nothing. Several Jewish businesses were boycotted. Some Jews received death threats. Many moved away from the city in which they had such deep roots. I've seen estimates of 50% leaving Atlanta for at least a few years. The anti-Semitism surrounding the trial also made an impact nationally. 1913 saw the formation of the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League. A terrible result of the lynching was the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, which had been dormant for decades, but was now revitalized, beginning with a cross burning at Stone Mountain, 25 miles from Atlanta. Leo Frank's trial is often linked with those of Alfred Dreyfus, accused of treason in Paris, and Mendel Bayless, accused of ritual murder in Tsarist Russia. All three turning points in modern Jewish history because they revealed venomous anti-Semitism. Daisy and her contemporaries were often referred to as the Leo Frank generation. His widow remained in Atlanta and was a close friend of Yuri's grandmother, the model for Daisy, as I've said. Lucille Frank, who lived until 1957, never remarried, and was a living reminder of her husband's gruesome murder as she made her social rounds. Afraid of aftershocks, Atlanta's Jews discouraged journalists from reinvestigating the case. They kept a low profile. Not one Jew ran for public office over the next generation. Yuri said he grew up in the 1940s feeling he wasn't quite white. Now, I doubt a Bay Area Jew would say that, even in that turbulent decade. Yuri regretted he was born a Jew, but Daisy's Jewish identity formed well before the Frank case, during a confident period for Atlanta Jewry. Her Jewish identity went deeper. And as you saw in the film, she disdains her daughter-in-law's showy Christmas display. Daisy is a proud congregant of Atlanta's oldest and most prestigious synagogue, known simply as the Temple, where she regularly attends Sabbath services. Now, although on a smaller scale, it resembled the ultra-reform Congregation Emmanuel of San Francisco, comprised mostly of wealthy, long-standing German Jewish families. The liturgy was almost entirely shorn of Hebrew. The services were modeled in part after the Episcopalian Church. They thought that this kind of conformity with Christianity would shield them from anti-Semitism, which they believed would be more likely directed at the traditional Jewish denominations, where the difference from mainline Protestantism was more pronounced. Let's look at the next slide. I wanted to show you here a line from the Broadway play. This is missing from the film, but this line of the play, I think, really reveals this mindset of Daisy and her contemporaries. So as they approach the synagogue, they get stuck in traffic. Hoke says, "Somebody done bombed the temple." And here's Daisy's response. "Well, it's a mistake. I'm sure they meant to bomb one of the conservative synagogues or the Orthodox one. This temple is reform. Everybody knows that." Okay, you can remove that. Even when she granted that the bombing was an act of anti-Semitism, Daisy wanted to keep it separate from racism. In fact, it was neo-Confederate white supremacists who bombed the Atlanta Temple and others in the South. But when Daisy and Hoke learn of the explosion, he brings up a lynching he witnessed, one among hundreds of blacks that took place in Georgia. Daisy curtly dismisses any connection between the two kinds of hate crimes. Now, this German Jewish elite also distanced itself from the influx of working class East European Jewish immigrants who came from New York or elsewhere in the Northeast. Like in San Francisco at this time, the Jewish blue bloods feared being put in the same category as these more identifiable Jews, and they looked down on the Yiddish speakers as uncouth carpetbaggers. This thick social barrier dividing the Jewish community is the main theme of another play in Alfred Urey's Atlanta trilogy. In The Last Night of Ballyhoo, set in 1939, it seems like a recently arrived young left-wing Brooklyn Jew is speaking a different language than his girlfriend, the daughter of a deep-rooted Atlanta family. At one point, he stops by her home and is taken aback by the Christmas tree in the parlor. Later, he's shunned at her German Jewish social club, and the couple breaks up. So, the well-to-do Atlanta-born Daisy, she belongs to an exclusive, aloof Jewish coterie. They can't relate anti-Semitism to the assaults on the blacks, and they don't even identify with most other American Jews. Now, to be sure, they rarely converted to Christianity or even married outside of Judaism. But it's often said that they were Southerners first, Americans second, Jews third. Now, these three loyalties were especially hard to reconcile, beginning in 1948, when the film opens. The dawn of a new struggle for civil rights in the South. President Truman supported integration, but he was stymied by a strong, unified bloc of Southern senators from his own party, the Dixiecrats. He could integrate the armed forces, but only by executive order. The Southern Bloc was led by Georgia's all-powerful Senator Richard Russell, staunch defender of the Jim Crow laws. And that's why the schools remain segregated as well as other public places. The state's other senator, Herman Talmadge, and its governor were no less defiant. These popular politicians, echoing the large majority of white public opinion, no mixing of the races. Many Northern Jews, as we know, traveled to the South, especially the Freedom Summer of 1964, to bolster the Black civil rights groups. They risked their lives. Two lost their lives. But almost all could return home and resume their lives. But what of the Southern Jews, like those in the film, who continued to live in this hyper-racist environment? How would they respond? The typical reaction was sympathy for African Americans, but only expressed privately. We see this in the character of Booley, who in 1965 feels he can't be seen at the banquet honoring native son Martin Luther King Jr. Some of his customers wouldn't understand, he says. It would be bad for business. It's telling that Southern Jewish institutions, including all the JCCs, remain segregated until the mid-1960s. But before we judge their passivity too harshly, let's keep in mind their fear of reprisal, fear all too real. 4 Southern synagogues were bombed and 3 other bomb plots were detected in 1958 alone. This wave of terror obviously weighed heavily upon the Southern rabbis. Among the roughly 100 Jewish spiritual leaders across the South, Only 7 or 8 publicly advocated integration in the 1950s and early 60s, and only 2 with the approval of their congregations. The overwhelming majority chose to stand aside in silence. At least 1 in Mississippi preached segregation, reminding us somewhat of the Southern rabbis a century earlier who defended slavery. One of the very few who spoke out for racial equality was Daisy's rabbi, Jacob Rothschild, and that's why the temple was bombed. A Northerner, he took the pulpit of the Venerable Synagogue in 1946. Only 35, he had matured early, having been an army chaplain at the Battle of Guadalcanal. On our study tour in 2017, we had an emotional meeting in the temple with his widow, Atlanta-born Janice Rothschild Blumberg, 93 years old and in excellent shape. She spoke to us about her late husband's rabbinate and their family life while they brought up 2 children in the midst of this turmoil. Now, what was Atlanta like in the early post-war years when the film begins? It had just opened a new airport. It was beginning to attract major corporations and emerge as the economic hub of the Southeast. And it was relatively moderate on racial issues. Hence, the famous motto as early as the 1950s, a city too busy to hate. But it was hard to be sanguine, even in Atlanta. When Rabbi Rothschild, declaring social justice a religious issue, publicly denounced segregation, he got a mixed reception from his congregation. One board member expressed his trepidation, saying, "Will he cause another Leo Frank case?" In 1955, the Temple Sisterhood invited Reverend Benjamin Mays, the president of the historically Black Morehouse College in Atlanta, accompanied by his wife, to speak at a luncheon. Another leading congregant pointed out that integrated dining was prohibited in Georgia. Rothschild tried to disarm him with a quip saying, "The couple will be seated at the head table, and all of us white folks will be segregated around them." Another incident shows the tension in the air. The Rothschilds invited Martin Luther King and his wife, Coretta, to dinner at their home. The Kings found the neighborhood, but then got lost. And in this age before GPS, they had to ask for directions. MLK sent Coretta to a neighbor's door, so they think she was a servant when asking for the location of the rabbi's house. King later told the Rothschilds he didn't want to endanger their family if it was thought that the rabbi was socializing with a Black civil rights leader and his wife. And then in October 1958, 5 white supremacists bombed the temple. Let's take a look at the next slide. First, I just wanted to show you the temple. See, it's just so elegant. And it's on the cover of what I believe is by far the best book on this, The Temple Bombing by Melissa Fay Green. There you see it's honored as National Book Award finalist. It's written like almost like a suspense novel, but it also reflects just prodigious research that she did. If you are interested in reading a book on the temple bombing, this is the one I highly recommend. 50 sticks of dynamite exploded in the middle of the night. So there were no injuries, but the structure was seriously damaged. Let's scroll down to the next slide. You see the damage there in the upper photo. This crime received national coverage. President Eisenhower not only issued a statement, but instructed the FBI to investigate, setting a precedent for combating these kind of hate crimes. Unlike the Leo Frank tragedy, this time Atlanta's mayor, the moderate William Hartsfield, condemned the attack and went to the temple to express his sympathy. In that upper photo, it's Hartsfield is on the left and Rabbi Rothschild is on the right. And there they are, right in the wreckage of the temple. Because of all the goodwill, completely absent 45 years earlier, Janice Rothschild would call the blast the bomb that healed. The rabbi focused on restoring the temple and comforting his congregants, and his sense of humor was an asset. On the first Friday evening after the bombing, the Kabbalat Shabbat service in the partly wrecked sanctuary was filled to overflowing. The rabbi's opening words to the hushed crowd, "So this is what it takes to get you to the temple?" Now, it's a travesty that only one of the 5 perpetrators, the ringleader, was put on trial. There are the 5 perpetrators sitting on that bench. The ringleader is the second from the left. The court was packed with KKK supporters, obviously putting great pressure on the jurors, one of whom was a Klansman himself. Despite a mountain of evidence against the domestic terrorist, as we call him today, there was a hung jury. And at the second trial, he was acquitted. His 4 henchmen were not even indicted. So while things had improved since 1915, the specter of Leo Frank was still haunting Atlanta. There were no further attacks on the temple, but the rabbi continued to receive death threats. Okay, thank you. We can remove that slide. By the late 1960s, racial politics changed as the Black Power movement became increasingly prevalent. Rothschild strongly opposed it, and he lost many Black friends. So now he became persona non grata, this time to part of the African American community. Let's look at the next slide. He remained a close friend of the King family. And it was Rabbi Rothschild who chaired that large tribute in honor of King winning the Nobel Peace Prize, the banquet in 1965 that you see in the film. The very fact of such a high-profile interracial dinner, which Daisy attends, was a turning point in race relations for the city. And there's that quote at the bottom by Rabbi Rothschild. "What I'm doing is my responsibility as a rabbi. Don't think I like endangering the security of our institutions, and even my family, God forbid. But I'm here and life requires it, and so be it." Okay, we can remove that now. Rabbi Rothschild, who served until his death in 1973, was probably a factor in Daisy's gradual appreciation of folks' humanity. I know here I'm talking about Daisy as if she's a real person, That's because she is modeled so closely along the lines of the author's grandmother. And I say that Rothschild may have been a factor because Daisy routinely heard his weekly sermons. Now, by the 1970s, after the fight against the hateful Jim Crow laws in the South had been won, the Black Jewish encounter changed. As we know, issues such as affirmative action, school busing, urban crime, police reform divided the two groups, sometimes bitterly. Even during the civil rights era, there was more friction between African Americans and Jews than is commonly discussed. We see a hint of this in the film. Daisy's invitation to Hoke to attend the King banquet was an afterthought, given at the last minute, and he feels he's being patronized and declines to come. Daisy says things are changing. He pushes back, saying, not changing all that much. Now, that conversation is set in 1965. But when the film came out, almost a quarter century later, in 1989, some in the Black community felt a much more forceful rebuke of Daisy's rose-colored, self-satisfied presumption was called for. For them, the character of Hoke was a derogatory stereotype of Black servility and passivity. Several reviewers compared him to the enslaved Mammy in Gone with the Wind, also set in Atlanta, and even to that icon of subservience, Uncle Tom, in the classic novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe. For one of these Black critics, Driving Miss Daisy is, quote, one scene after another of a pompous old lady issuing orders and a servant trying to comply by saying yes'm. Sure, she teaches Hoke how to read, but they claim this is mere white paternalism. Now, I think a more valid criticism is that, unlike Daisy, Hoke's relationship to his family and friends is missing. These critics say, again, I think this is more valid, that what's needed is a scene in which he is away from upscale Druid Hills and reveals to other Blacks what he really feels about working for the rich, elderly Jewish lady. Still others held that for an African American to be a lead actor, especially opposite a white woman, the studio heads felt they had to cast him in a non-threatening role, that is, older, docile, and desexualized. These reviewers wrote that in the mind of Hollywood executives, a virile young Black man could keep white audiences away. So a controversy erupted at the Academy Awards in 1990 when Driving Miss Daisy won for Best Picture. Jessica Tandy, at age 80, won for Best Actress. And Alfred Urey for Best Adapted Screenplay, that's adapting his own play. It also had 6 other nominations, including Morgan Freeman for Best Actor and Dan Aykroyd as Bully for Best Supporting Actor. Let's look at the next slide. It was a controversy at the Oscars because another outstanding film of 1989, also about race, was virtually overlooked. Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, which he produced himself. Set in Brooklyn's seething Bed-Stuy and filled with inner city violence between Blacks and Italian Americans, it's the opposite of Driving Miss Daisy in almost every respect. It vividly depicts boycotts, demonstrations, and police brutality, all very much in the headlines in the 1980s, and ends with a frenzied race riot, including arson. Just as Daisy conveys a growing friendship, Do the Right Thing depicts deepening hostility. Spike Lee was furious to have been snubbed, not least of all because so many of the awards and nominations were garnered by Daisy, a movie he deplored for sugarcoating the problem of race in America. He assailed it in terms too vulgar for me to repeat. These two films of 1989 reveal the end of one era and the beginning of another in the portrayal of Blacks in American cinema. After Do the Right Thing, other movies reflecting Black rage at the white establishment became both critical and commercial successes, such as John Singleton's Boys in the Hood in 1991 and Spike Lee's biopic Malcolm X the following year. Okay, you can remove that slide now. Now, of course, Black fury had long been expressed brilliantly in literature. Think of Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker. But before Spike Lee, Hollywood had shied away from bringing this deep-seated anger to the big screen. That changed during the racial strife that boiled over at this time, the late 80s and early 90s, which could not be hushed up. The whole country was disturbed by it. One surge of violence took place in the mixed neighborhood of Crown Heights, Brooklyn, when a Hasidic driver accidentally ran over two Guyanese children, killing one of them. Many local Blacks then went on a rampage for days, attacking ultra-Orthodox Jews and ransacking their businesses. The following year, the acquittal of the 4 policemen who savagely beat Rodney King set off a 3-day race riot in Los Angeles that took the lives of over 60 people and injured thousands. Now, defenders of Driving Miss Daisy admitted that when it came out, Black power was in the ascendancy and Black indignation in the news media. But they stressed that the film sought to capture an interracial relationship from an earlier era, when segregation in Atlanta was opposed by the nonviolent leadership of Martin Luther King, inspiring whites and Blacks, a groundbreaking and bold movement for its time. The characters of Daisy and Hope, born in the 19th century, grew up in an age earlier still, when there was no flexibility at all in the South's caste system. A main point of the film, evidently missed by the critics I've mentioned, is that even in a viciously racist society, Hoke is no mere lackey, but has actually carved out a measure of human dignity. People who watched the movie over 30 years ago recall the scene in which he defies Daisy in order to relieve himself. He takes the car keys and goes into the roadside bushes to urinate because, being black, he had not been allowed to use the toilet when they stopped at a gas station early. He defies Daisy, but Hoke also knows the barriers, the dangers he's facing in Georgia. And he ably navigates this treacherous terrain. That was the painful plight for Southern blacks then, who simply could not be as assertive as those in the North, nor could they be as forceful as the generations that came after them in the South. That is the strength of Driving Miss Daisy. It is a portrait of a time and place that is not revised by what came later, almost like a photograph. As Alfred Urey has said, you should not read the present into the past. Thank you.
Fred, excellent. Thank you so much. We'll do questions in a minute. I just want to thank everyone who is a donor to Around the World with Fred, which is made possible by contributions from community members, including the Goodman Family Foundation, the Lubitsky Foundation, the Winnick family, the Ogun family, Joanne and Arnold Jacobson, Susan and Howard Gaifman, and Martha Ann and Sandy Wishnev. You can always donate at eastbayjewishfilm.org so we can continue this wonderful series Around the World with Fred and our other year-round programming. Just I found in my library talking about, I'm trying to, which way do I hold it? Judah P. Benjamin, The Jewish Confederate by Evans. So we were talking about him before. It's a bit, a few years old, but nevertheless, and a newer book by San Francisco State Professor Mark Dollinger, Black Power and Jewish Politics. So I don't know if Fred wants to recommend some other books, but those are at least two that I have in my library.
Yeah, let me just say very quickly, those are excellent choices. The biography of Judah P. Benjamin is just outstanding. That's, of course, Louisiana, not Georgia, but very, very similar, even though it's, 100 years earlier during the Civil War. Some of you know Eli Evans because of his book, The Provincials, about growing up in the South. This, I think, exceeds it. This is his best book. And that can tell you so much about Southern Jewry. Judah P. Benjamin also owned 80 slaves, and then my friend Mark Dollinger, of course, San Francisco State. And that sheds new light on this thing I just mentioned so briefly, the rift actually between the Jews and the blacks, even during the civil rights struggle. Okay, thank you, Reva, for bringing those up.
Lynn Feingold shares in the chat, as a Southern Jew from rural Southwest Georgia, your presentation resonated on every level. As the only Jewish residents in our town, we were not considered white by our Black neighbors and friends, but as biblical folk. On your 2017 tour of the South, did you also visit rural locations?
Well, I wouldn't say rural, but we went to some smaller towns. But one of them, Macon, Georgia, which had a Jewish community. But I want to say that we did two other study tours through the South that went through Mississippi, starting in Memphis and then going all through Mississippi down to New Orleans. And we went to many small towns in Mississippi, and it was really something like almost being in a foreign country in your own country in many respects. And we found in a small town in Mississippi, I believe this was Indianola, Mississippi, there was a country club, and we had lunch there with a few people from the small Jewish community. And even then, that tour must have been around 2014, 15. The woman in the couple said to us, very openly that she feels more comfortable with a non-Jewish Southerner than with a Jew from New York. And that was only 10 years ago. So a lot of that is still there. Anyway, I appreciate that input. Thank you.
Please, if you have questions, use the chat function. A question I have for you, sorry. Things got worse, of course, with Leo Frank, and even before, as he moved from the northeast to the south. Were there other things going on in American Southern society that made Jews less welcome, whereas they may have been a bit more welcome earlier on in America's history?
Yeah, there are a few things. Naturally, given my work on the history of the Jews of the Bay Area, I was constantly comparing this with San Francisco. It's a very, very different situation. In one respect, you have religion is much more important in the South than it was in the far West. And so just being of another religion, just for that reason, Jews stood out much more. So that was one thing. The other thing was as time went on, certainly by the 1950s, this feeling that Jews were allied with the blacks, or that they were potentially allied. And certainly the influx of Northern Jews, in that Freedom Summer, Jews were so well represented in that movement. I read that more than half of those college students were Jewish. They came from the North, they came into the South. So that certainly caused a very, very big backlash. Then, as I mentioned in my talk, in a place like Atlanta, which was pretty small, it was founded relatively late, 1845. It was just really a small town, but then it just boomed due to the railways and the industrialism, the urbanization, that disoriented people. Much more than in the far West, where people were sort of expecting change and experimentation and different things. The Southern tradition seemed to be threatened by this new world. And they felt that very often they felt that Jews were the bearers of this kind of modernity. So these were factors that contributed to the anti-Semitism. By the way, just quickly to add, there were also a lot of anti-Catholicism at the same time, also emanating from the Klan and similar groups.
Any other questions? I was looking in my library, so I may have missed it. Did you mention the ADL?
Yes. I said that the ADL was formed in the same year as the Frank trial.
So, and it continues to look at the unfortunate surge of anti-Semitism we see now. If there are no other questions, we want to thank you. Your talk is so extensive. Oh, yes, someone has a Helen Sweet. We went to Atlanta, including services at the temple. This summer we saw Parade, which is about the Leo Frank case, and it's a musical. Whether or not it should be or not, but I'm sure all the songs are not happy ones. The play showed many people giving false testimony against Frank, as enlisted by the prosecutor. Did you find out anything about that in your research?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. First of all, that play is right here in New York, where I'm speaking from. And it was a revival that opened just last June, or even earlier. And it was a big hit. And Yuri won a Tony Award for that, okay? And as I mentioned in my talk, Leo Frank case was so much on his mind. That's the play that he's the proudest of all of his works, Now, as for the false testimony, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they put witnesses on the stand who just lied about Frank and, gave the impression that he had, was not sexually abused, so somehow, had sexual overtones in terms of relationships with other employees. It was really something that they stopped at nothing and just assumed that he was guilty, even though, like I said, all the evidence pointed to Jim Conley,
I want to
Um,
thank you.
yeah, I just wanted to mention on the trial, there's so much that's written on this trial. Um, there are a number of very good books. One of them is called "A Little Girl Is Dead," and another one is just called "The Leo Frank Case." That's one of the earlier ones by Leonard Dinnerstein, who's really an outstanding historian. So you can read up on that in great detail with book-length works. Okay.
I want to thank you so much. Again, November 2nd, 7 p.m., Around the World with Fred looks at the History Society of Hungarian Jews. We will stream for the same registration the brilliant film Gloomy Sunday. It is really sensual, beautifully filmed, stellar acting, and a powerful punch at the end. So Fred will be doing that. And then we hope he will look at the Jews of China through a rather convoluted film, which we'll talk about later. It's hard to find films that are great with connected to China and also a Jewish, but we found one. So that hopefully will be in January. Until then, everyone, Shana Tova, health, peace, happiness, and a lot of great films to everyone. Toda, Erev Tov.
Anatoma.